Now, you have a broad frame of reference in regards to social work. In the Black community, a popular saying is that the white man's ice is colder than the Black man's ice.
Yeah.
You work at an HBCU, sorry, and have vast experience researching Black people in drug courts and in the outcomes. What are your thoughts on how Black people respond to Black social workers as opposed to white social workers?
So and I'll start with my research. What I have found is that in some treatment courts, African Americans have said, and again, I interview them, either I do focus groups or individual interviews, and say, how can this program be improved? Some African American participants would say, we wish we had more people in the program that look like us. African American participants, we wish there were more African American participants, staff, judges, addiction and mental health counselors. And not once, again, in my experience, certainly as a white man, did they say, they're not saying white people can't help us. They're saying, we do wish, though, we know this area is a pretty diverse area, and there's a lot of African Americans in this area, but we don't see them represented in this program. That in itself is disempowering. And we have found that treatment courts that have an equal representation of, say, African American participants and staff tend to produce better outcomes. And what I mean, let's just say we look, and I can do some research, say your treatment court should be 50% white and 50% Black. And then we actually go to the treatment court, and there's about 50% white participants, 50% Black participants. And the racial makeup of staff, judges, treatment providers, probation officers is pretty diverse. There's something about that. We don't know yet. Certainly I can speak to camaraderie, right? Or just the sheer fact of what some participants have said to me of, we wish there was more people in the program that looked like us. That in itself tends to lead to positive outcomes, meaning I've gone to programs where it's 50% white, 50% Black. It should be that way to be representative of the arrest population of the community. And there I say, wow, across graduation rates, African Americans are graduating at 55%, and so are white participants. So through my research, first, as I share there, that there tends to be a value of, again, camaraderie, or simply put, as African American participants have shared with me in different courts throughout this country, if you want to improve the drug court, find out why there aren't more African Americans in the program. Because I know they're getting arrested in our community. I know they're represented in our community. In regards to social work as a whole, what I have found is that certainly the age of a social worker, our race, our mannerisms, our expertise, our confidence, our training, all of that matters. The most valuable skill that you can have as a social worker is kindness. That brotherly and sisterly love I spoke about earlier, compassion, empathy, humbleness, curiosity, and being genuine. And what I mean by that is I've worked with patients, and I've been doing counseling, and I still do it part-time, 20 years. I've had patients say, you know what, I really don't want to work with a man. Can you refer me to a female therapist? Absolutely. I'd really like to work with an African-American woman. Do you have one? Could you make a referral there? Absolutely. See, the clients are patients. The individuals we work with, they are the experts of their own life, not us as social workers ever. And I tell my students, if you give them a safe, confidential, compassionate environment for them to open up, for them to make behavioral changes, for them to heal from whatever they need to heal from, that is, and I make this number up, but that's 80% of counseling, providing a safe, compassionate place for people to change. Now, in no way do I say that. I do believe strongly that's it. What if you want to work with anyone, regardless of their race, their history, the issue or problem they're experiencing in their life, provide a safe, non-judgmental, confidential, loving environment for them to change. That's key. And understand, I tell patients or my students, if a patient says, hey, I don't want to work with you, I want to work with someone else, it's okay. We should praise that they're speaking up and being assertive. And I say that as been doing it for 2 decades. I have done therapy groups for women who have histories of trauma. And I go in as a social worker. All the patients in the group are women who have a history of trauma. I'm not a woman. I don't have a history of trauma. Quite frankly, don't know much about being a woman. I know quite a bit about trauma. And I go in, I'm genuine about that, and emphasize social work, compassion, empathy, providing that non-judgmental environment. When I was in Indiana, I did a group. And the group was for African-American men. And the theme was the relationship between historical trauma, historical racism, and addiction. I went into that group as a white man, knowing very little about racism and historical trauma and its connection with addiction. But I knew a lot about addiction, but I knew a lot about how to provide a genuine environment for people to share their stories. Now, again, I share this as, hey, I'm a white man working with women with trauma. I'm a white man working with African-American men who are in the criminal justice system talking about addiction and historical trauma. In no way am I minimizing the impact of race on this. Because certainly if someone says, and I've seen it in my research, I want to go to counseling, but I would just feel more comfortable working with another Black man. We say, thank you for being open and honest. You know you best. And if that's what provides that comfort, that's what you want. If we're able to make that referral and set that up, that's what we do. The other thing that I emphasize in my teaching and work with students is that certainly the color of our skin, we're not colorblind. We're aware of it. And we can talk about it. But when we talk about in social work, the idea of diversity, and trust me, I was caught up in this for many years. When we think about diversity, we think Black or white. Diversity is certainly your race, it's your sex, it's your gender, it's where you grew up, it's your life experience, it's how you spend your weekends, it's the books that you read. Diversity is every life experience we bring to the table. And our job as social workers is to provide that, again, that safe environment for patients to share their story. And I truly believe, and again, I say it kind of broadly, 80% of the therapeutic environment is providing that non-judgmental compassion and empathy. That's 80%. You make a patient, a family feel safe where they can talk and they're heard. 20% is the skill and knowledge base that you have. Because I've had patients, John, you're a great therapist, man. I've changed and I'm clean for 6 months and I'm in recovery. And man, I thank you. And in my head, I'm like, I really didn't even do anything besides listen, validate how you feel, and provide maybe some advice or support along the way. But I say, you take the credit. You did the hard work for this. So I hope that kind of answered your question, that we aren't. I remember When I started in the field, I went to some training. That's a long time ago, but it was about being colorblind. Like that was actually the theme back in the day with like addiction ethics. Whether someone's black or white, male, we're blind to that. We treat everyone equal. And I say, we are absolutely not blind. We want to be aware of who we are, our experiences, and talk about it and embrace it. Our diversity is cool. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's good to learn people's different experiences. And this requires, though, us to we got to have real conversations. You, Todd, I'm sure you've heard, and we've heard people say, implicit bias. And I see it on the news every day, and police officers, implicit bias and implicit bias, implicit bias. And what are we talking about? Like implicit bias is real. Don't get me wrong, it exists. But what are we talking about? In order for us to address implicit bias, we must first reflect on our own life experiences that have implicitly, unintentionally created oppression in our own thoughts and in our own hearts. And so students and I say, okay, here's implicit bias. Now let's have, again, this is at Morgan State University. Let's have a real conversation about it. And the story I share, and this, sometimes people are taken back. This is implicit bias. When I grew up and I went from a white suburban community where I went to grade school to then I went to high school in the city of Harrisburg, an urban community, where I went from an all-white grade school, 99.9% white, to a high school that was mostly, mixed black and white. I was now exposed in my first time to an urban culture. I was actually kind of intrigued by it and just, I found a lot of love and really enjoyed the city. But in high school, remember I shared earlier, I had kind of a misspent youth. I got in lots of trouble and, drugs, alcohol, stuff like that, get in trouble. And this speaks to implicit bias. My mom would say to me, John, when you go down to the city, stay away from that neighborhood. And there was a neighborhood. John, if you're going down, hang out with your friends, don't go to that neighborhood. And the neighborhood that she was referencing was a neighborhood she didn't want me going there because there was a high crime rate and lots of drugs. So to this day, I would say to my daughters, Morgan and Carly, be careful if you go to that neighborhood. I prefer if you don't have to, stay away from that neighborhood. There's a high crime rate. So my mom, being a great mom, as parents would do, John, stay away from that neighborhood. Stay away from that neighborhood. You're going out with your friends. I don't want you going in that neighborhood. Okay. Well, eventually, as I'm growing up, my mom giving a positive message, hey, son, I love you. I want you to be safe. Stay away from that neighborhood because there's a high crime rate. Eventually, though, that was the black community. And as I got older, as a young man in high school, my mom doesn't want me going there. But as I got older, the implicit mind can say, I got a message as a young man saying, don't go to this neighborhood because there's a high crime rate and there's lots of drug use. And then as I got older, associated that with African Americans. That is where implicit bias is developed. And I share this with students, and students will say, but your mom was doing the right thing. I wouldn't want my kids going to a neighborhood that has problems. I said, oh yeah, implicit bias it's implicit. It can be developed with all the good intentions in mind. But it's not until we reflect and say, wow, if I did not take this implicit bias, because my mom didn't say, don't go to the neighborhood because it's the black community. She never said that. Don't go to the neighborhood. She would say, there's lots of trouble there. Lots of crime there. We don't want you getting in trouble anymore. You got enough problems with the law. But eventually I associate implicitly crime, drug use, violence with African Americans. That's implicit bias. And sometimes I say, damn, John, that's real. Well, implicit bias is real. And we have to have the conversations, because if we just say implicit bias, don't project your implicit biases in counseling. Don't be aware of your implicit biases in social work. If we don't have a real conversation about what implicit biases are, it's going to go over people's head. We have to help students, social workers, all of us dig deep, explore, and be real, and figure out what they may be, because when they're no longer implicit, they become explicit. We're aware of them. And when we're aware of them is when we can do something about it, such as me sharing the story with you today. Have I historically in my life, because of that implicit bias, implicitly I associated African American communities with higher crime rates and violence and drug use because of a message I got as a child that is real? Being able to have conversations about it is what takes the, say, implicit power away from it. And so when we talk about diversity, that being one example, me, I'm a white male, 2 daughters, I'm Catholic, right? We 43, we have all these things, but I also have these experiences as a child that are positive. I was really intrigued by urban communities, by the city of Harrisburg, when I went from a white suburb to a city. I believe that feeling intrigued and wanting to learn more has helped me be where I'm at today. But it also has allowed me to be real and genuine. Because honestly, I don't think 2 years ago, when I was at Indiana University, and again, I love Indiana University. I think I've said that a lot. Had nothing to do with the university, it had to do with my comfort level. I wasn't having real conversations about race. I was talking about implicit bias and moving on. Now at Morgan State University, and I thank the students, not me, they've created an environment to say, hey, John, we're real. You can be real. We all have these biases and experiences and unintentionally oppressive messages or stereotypes that we grew up with, or maybe we're even still exposed to. Let's take the power away from it by talking about it. And again, that speaks to the power of what I say as an HBCU. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when I was at my last university, I did not have this conversation. Now I have this conversation where I can say, let me give you one example of many in my life of where implicit biases can come from.
As much as you've gotten from your students and as much as you've gotten from HBCUs, I'm pretty sure that they are thankful that they have a professor like you that can explain something like implicit bias in a way that I've never heard it explained before. And it really just even hit home for a 41-year-old man like me after all these years. And when I was in high school, I was in a group called SCORE, the Student Group on Race Relations. And I had never heard implicit bias explained like that. So thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, absolutely.